Okay, welcome everyone. Bruchim habayim and Aziz and Pesach to everyone also. Okay, we do understand that having our last meeting the night before Seder was maybe not the best planning that we could have possibly done, and we are going to try to get you home as quickly as we can. Of course, planning second Seder on the night of the Michigan game also wasn't good planning, and I had nothing to do with that. Sometimes it's just the way it is, and I'm glad you're all here. This is going to be our chance. Now, I will say, there are a few things have changed a little bit, and actually that will help us get home a little quicker. Because we did, as you know, we had about 25, 30 people having to drop for horrible reasons, cancer and terrible. You guys should be lucky you're all healthy, it's good, you know. So everything's being handled in Israel, and actually you'll get your bus assignments when you get to your buses, because it's just too much, it's just changing too quickly, it just changed too quickly. So you'll see a sign, it'll be your name, you'll get on a bus, everybody on your bus is gonna be your best friend by the time you get to the end. I guarantee it 100%. It's really an amazing thing that happens. So we're not gonna have a bus meeting, but we will at the end of the lecture, those who want to stay, who are coming to Israel, we're just gonna do a little introduction, just so you get to see, put a face with a name, basically. That's what we're gonna do and that should only take about 20 minutes, and you'll be able to go. We'll have some last minute questions. So that's the plan for the evening, but before that, did you want to say something?
No, just how nice it'll be when we get to the Seder and we say next year in Jerusalem. I think someone mentioned that first it'll be next week in Jerusalem, so maybe we can have a little chorus of that. Hashua Haba'a Ve'Yerushalayim would be nice. But I'm really looking forward to traveling with all of you, and so is Jen.
And I also just want to fail a little bit. I have to say, the itinerary, this has been my toughest itinerary to create, because we had this whole first-timer, second-timer thing, but sometimes problems lead to creativity. You know what I mean? Sometimes by solving a problem, you get somewhere you never would have gone before if you didn't have the problem. And there's some great things we're doing on this itinerary that I've never done, and I'm really extremely excited about. And they're just sort of getting settled now this week, thank God. And I think, is there anything else? I did, in the letter that we sent, we did mention we are leaving when it's still Passover. So if you didn't read, I just want to remind you, if you're like me, and I don't keep kosher, but I don't eat bread or pasta on Passover, so I didn't really want to be served that on the meal, so I made a kosher meal for myself. I think Wendy is actually more going to just bring her own meal, or you could pick around, or do whatever you want. We don't check, your kashrut on the plane or anything. If it was El Al, we would, but it's Delta, so we can't do that. Whatever you do will be fine, but that is something I hadn't thought of. But one of the exciting things is so in our family, we do break fast. We break our Passover. We have a very traditional way to do it. We go to Tomatoes of Pizza. That's our, every year we go to Tomatoes of Pizza. This year, for the first time in my life, we're going to be doing a mamuna, which is the way Israelis, it's a Sephardic custom, the way Israelis break, we'll be doing it with them. So members of the Reform community. So that's just one of the little exciting things I've never done before, and I'm really excited about to share with all of you, as is Rabbi Lawson and our spouses and Cantor Smolesh as well. So with no further ado, and we'll talk a little bit more about the trip when we are at the end. But right now, I think we've missed a big hole in Israeli history. We haven't really talked about the state, right? Is that true, Professor?
I haven't told you that.
I don't think we've talked about the state. It's sort of a pretty important thing to know before you actually get to Israel. You'll be seeing a lot of it. So with no further ado, Professor Howard Lupovitch.
Oh, it does. Hello, everybody. Erev Tov. Before I forget, Chag Sameach v'Kasher, a happy Pesach to everybody. I have to admit, I have never given a lecture in my life on the night before Pesach. So this really is different than any other night, different. But, so within what I'm going to say, what I am going to promise you is, I promise you 2 good nuggets you can use at your Seder if you want, pertinent to this topic. You don't have to. If you find them interesting, they're right in here. Everyone has one of these handouts? Okay. So this evening, I'm going to talk to you really about, what I want to talk to you about is how the State of Israel came to be. It was the crystallization of a movement called Zionism, which obviously we hear about Zionism all the time. for better or for worse. Zionism is something not only well known these days, but quite controversial in some circles. And I want to talk about not only how the different visions, the different Zionist visions of what the Jewish state should be, but also some of the problems that grew out of those differing visions. And in particular, I want to talk about the focus on, well, really the origins of two present-day domestic problems, meaning the first being the tensions between religious and secular Jews. And I will explain to you what it means to be a secular Israeli. That's first, and also the problem between Jews who are Ashkenazic from Europe and Jews who are Middle Eastern, which manifests in the realm of income inequality. So I want to say something about that. But then also, I also want to say things about the current conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and the origins of that conflict. So while much of what I'm going to say this evening is going to be dealing with the past, I wanted to connect and give you some perspective and context and nuance about affairs, what our rabbis called inyana diyoma, the affairs of the day, today. So, where to begin? Let's start by defining the word Zionism itself, because the very term itself tells us something very important about the movement Zionism and its aim. So, the ism part of Zionism, what an ism does to any word, it turns a word into a movement or an ideology. So socialism, capitalism, liberalism. So in this particular case, the ism is transforming the word Zion. So let's talk about what the word Zion means. In Hebrew, Zion is Zion. This is a word from the Hebrew Bible, which is significant for a reason I will explain in a moment. But it has three different meanings in the Hebrew Bible. In its most literal sense, Zion refers to the area around Jerusalem. You will visit Mount Zion, Har Zion. In a slightly broader sense, sometimes Zion is used, it's used synonymously to refer to Jerusalem. And in some other sense, Zion refers to the entire land of Israel. So it has those different meanings. And I mention this because long before there ever was a movement called Zionism, since ancient times, there has been a concept in Judaism called Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. Since Jews first went into exile, and that's a very long time. That was the end of the last talk. 586 BCE, the prophet Jeremiah laid down this notion of Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. So, we might be tempted to say that since Zionism and Shivat Zion, the return to Zion, the messianic return to Zion, they sound alike, that we might be tempted to conclude that they're the same, but they're not. Now, they seem the same. They're actually referring to the same, let's call it the same process. If we could have a fast action aerial camera pointing at the earth and filming the aim of Zionism and the aim of the messianic return to Zion, it would look the same. Jews from all over the world streaming to the land of Israel. But there's an important difference between this geographical movement, is that the messianic notion of Shivat Zion is divinely driven. It is a God-driven movement. Zionism from the start was humanist and secular. It was invented, it was devised by Jews for whom religion had no meaning. Most of them didn't believe in God. This was something humanist. And that is a very important difference. Now, already I've used a term which requires me to spend just a minute defining some vocabulary, because I refer to the land of Israel. And really, to understand what Israel is now, you have to be able to distinguish between two things. The land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, and the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael. They're not exactly the same. The land of Israel is, first of all, a geographic term. It refers to the territory which was the ancient kingdom of David and Solomon. The state of Israel was a political entity created in 1948 out of part of what was the land of Israel. The two are not exactly the same, and they're not synonymous. According to the Bible, the land of Israel that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob extends all the way to Iraq, to the Tigris-Euphrates River, and all the way to the border of Egypt, and includes half of Jordan, gets close to Damascus. That's different from the state of Israel. I think it's also worthwhile clarifying another term which you will hear, and we hear all the time, Palestine. Now, Palestine had one meaning until 1948, till the creation of the State of Israel, and then it had a different meaning. Prior to 1948, Palestine was simply and exclusively a geographic term. Originally, Palestine was the name given to the land of Israel by a 2nd century Roman emperor named Hadrian. It was a punishment to the Jews. It's a long story, but he chose Palestine because that's Latin for Philistine. Basically, Hadrian wanted to eliminate the memory of the land of Israel and Jewish kingdom from collective memory. But from that point on, Palestine was simply the Latin equivalent of the land of Israel. Until 1948, it was simply a geographic term, and many of the early Zionists themselves spoke about creating a Jewish state in Palestine. Jews who moved to the land of Israel, who made Aliyah, referred to themselves as Palestinian Jews. Now, after 1948, the term Palestine took on an additional political meaning with the advent of Palestinian nationalism. With the Arabs who lived in Palestine, they gave it a different meaning. So today, talking about a Jewish state in Palestine makes absolutely no sense. But before 1948, it made perfect sense. Everyone understands the difference. Okay, one other thing about terminology, and the reason I mentioned the difference between the Messianic return to Zion and Zionism is the founders of Zionism, they chose the name Zionism very self-consciously. Because even though they were secular Jews, and all forms of Zionism except one, which we'll mention this evening, these are secular Jews, even though they were secular, they still regarded the Jewish tradition as being important for historical and cultural reasons, although not for religious reasons. They loved the Hebrew Bible. So I'll give you another example. The term we use in modern Hebrew for going to the land of Israel, we don't say in Hebrew to go, lalechet or linsoa, we say la'alot. Aliyah means ascent. You don't go to Israel, you ascend to Israel. Or if you're in Israel, you don't go to Jerusalem, you don't drive to Jerusalem, you ascend to Jerusalem. Now, originally in Jewish tradition, that was a religious term. That meant going up in spirituality. That's why when someone is called to the Torah, it's called an aliyah. You are ascending to the Torah. But for the founders of Zionism, they spoke about aliyah in secular terms. They weren't talking about a religious experience. They loved to use religious language. Now, they used it for practical reasons. They wanted diaspora Jews who were secular to be attracted to Zionism. And maybe some who weren't secular to be attracted to Zionism, and using the language of Jewish tradition made Zionism more appealing and seemed less odd. Now, this was especially necessary because Zionism from the beginning, and you have to understand this is counterintuitive from a 21st century perspective. This was a radically innovative idea for Jews. Zionism was a revolution in Jewish consciousness. It was a revolution in Jewish consciousness for two reasons. First of all, Zionism proposed a radically new Jewish response or solution to the two threats that faced Jews in the diaspora. Now, what were these two threats? I'll bet if I asked you this question, because the two threats facing Jews now are the same two threats as faced Jews 100, 150 years ago when Zionism started. So what are the two greatest threats to Jewish survival? One is anti-Semitism, obviously, and that threat, that concern was borne out by the Holocaust. What's the other threat apart from anti-Semitism? Assimilation. And Zionism as a new Jewish consciousness or a new form of Jewish identity was designed to take as a new response, a radically new response to those two challenges. Now, not all Zionists focused equally on both challenges, but they both had both challenges in mind. So let me start there, all right? In fact, look at your handout. Look where it says texts. One of my favorite definitions or conceptualizations of Zionism was made by someone who's not even wasn't even Jewish, a historian of nationalism named Ernest Gellner, and this is what he said about Zionism. Zionism solved a European problem by creating an Asian one. Really, he meant Middle Eastern one. Now, the European problem that Zionism solved, according to Gellner, was how do Jews deal with the challenges of anti-Semitism and assimilation. So let's consider that for a moment. Let's consider the anti-Semitism part first, and then the assimilation challenge second. So, the first great anti-Semitic moment that Zionism responds to was in Russia in 1881. Now, in Russia in 1881, long story short, there were a series of pogroms against Russian Jews. A pogrom, if you don't know, isn't just a riot against Jews. It's a state-sponsored riot. It's a riot where you can't call the police because the police are in on it. The police organized it. Now, you might think, oh, Russian Jews, they were used to this kind of persecution. False. Prior to 1881, the previous time that Russian Jews had encountered violence on that scale was more than 200 years earlier in 1648, when it wasn't even Russia yet. They were still living in Poland. It was a series of massacres called the Khmelnytsky massacres. It had been over 200 years. That's a long, long time. And so these pogroms for Russian Jews were very traumatic. No one had any memory of this scale of violence. Not that Russia was perfect, but there hadn't been pogroms in Russia for more than 2 centuries. And the pogroms were compounded a year later by a series of anti-Jewish laws, one of which made it impossible for Russian Jews to make a living. These are known as the May laws, enacted by the Tsar. The law that I referred to as Jews were banned from working on Christian holidays or Sunday. And coupled with the fact that most Jews who did business wouldn't work on Saturday or Jewish holidays, it meant about 130 days a year that you couldn't keep your business open. And that's why many Russian Jews, between that and the violence of the pogroms, this is when Russian Jews began to despair. And here we see some very radical responses. Now, the most widespread response by Russian Jews was simply to leave. This is when most of our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents left Eastern Europe, left Russia, and came to America. That wave began after 1881. In some ways, that's a separate story. There was a smaller group of Russian Jews who believed that the best way to eliminate anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish prejudice was to transform Russia entirely. These were Jews who joined the Russian socialist movement and fought for social revolution. But there was an even smaller number who said that what this shows us is there is no real future for Jews anywhere in the diaspora, and the only way Jews are going to escape the danger of persecution is by gaining a sense of agency, control of their own destiny, through the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. And this is the beginning of Zionism. And the first to express this idea was a Russian Jew whose name was Leo or Lev Pinsker. Now, you probably expected me to say that the first Zionist was Theodor Herzl. No. He will enter this story in a minute. He came about 15 years later. But Pinsker was a Russian Jew who experienced the trauma of the pogroms, and in 1882 he wrote a terrific little essay, a pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation, in which he suggested that Jews, auto-emancipation meaning self-emancipation, Jews can no longer afford to wait for the state to protect them or rely on the state to guarantee their rights. Jews must take their destiny in their own hands. This is really the beginnings of Zionism. And in the 1880s and 1890s in Russia, there were these small little groups clustered around Pinsker and his idea. These were Jewish settlement organizations. They took Pinsker's idea, the notion of trying to create some kind of sovereign Jewish state, and they literally prepared to leave Russia and create new Jewish settlements in the land of Israel. And these two settlement organizations, there really were two, and you'll note they both have, these are both examples of secular Jews using biblical language. One group was called Chibat Zion, the Love of Zion movement. Or they were known as the lovers of Zion. That's a phrase right from the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Isaiah. The other group was called Bilu, which stood for Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha. House of Jacob, come let us depart. A verse from Isaiah chapter 2, from Isaiah's utopian vision. Secular Jews using religious language. And what they did is they created these local chapters in many Jewish communities, and they prepared to go. But in their mind, life in the diaspora was over. It was time to get Jews to leave. Okay? Now, they had limited success until the mid-1890s. By the mid-1890s, what these Russian Zionists, the followers of Pinsker, what they decided they needed to really get the movement going is they needed a different kind of leader. They needed a dynamic, high-profile Western European Jew who would attract more members, who could work with the Sultan. Of course, the Sultan was ruling in the land of Israel, and really put the movement on the map. And obviously, their first choice was a Rothschild. Their second choice was a high-profile British insurance and salesman named Moses Montefiore, who had created a new Jewish settlement outside the old city. You will visit. That's where the windmill is. Yamin Moshe. Neither the Rothschilds nor Montefiore was interested in Zionism as a movement because, like I said, Zionism at the time was radical. The idea of trying to ask Jews to leave Europe, which remember, the end of the 19th century, this is the age of European imperialism. This is when Europeans think they are the greatest people in the world. The idea of asking Europeans to leave Europe and go move to somewhere in the middle of the Middle East. And remember, the land of Israel didn't look like it did today. In 1880, the land of Israel was swamp and desert. That no Jews would, no one would want to do that. It sounded crazy. Just to make it clear, the idea in the 1880s or the 1890s, the idea of moving to the middle of the Middle East and creating a state there would be like me asking you, let's go found a Jewish state at the South Pole or on the moon. You know what? Let's go found a Jewish state on Mars. You know, we'll get Elon Musk to put us there. That's how far-fetched it sounded. It was crazy. They couldn't find the high-profile leader they were looking. Fortunately, there was this young man, a Central European Jew, born in Budapest, a journalist in Vienna, named Theodor Herzl, who became the leader of the movement. Now, his path to Zionism was a little different. He wasn't a Russian Jew. He had never encountered pogroms. But for him, anti-Semitism was more personal. He was an assimilated Hungarian and then Viennese Jew who had encountered the racial anti-Semitism of Vienna. I mean, long story short, when he was in university in Vienna, he wanted to join a fraternity, and fraternities in those days, in some way, they're the same as now. You drink lots of beer, but they were dueling clubs, you know, dueling with swords. And the problem was, what Herzl found out is that certain people were allowed to duel and certain people were not allowed to duel. In order to be allowed to duel, you had to be a person of honor. And honor in that context didn't mean the abstract way we use it. Certain types of people were honorable: nobles, high-ranking military officers, master craftsmen, members of the royal family. Certain people were not. Peasants, Jews. If you were a Jew, by definition, you lacked honor. Herzl didn't think himself as much of a Jew. If you had asked Herzl to define himself, he probably would have said Viennese first. He probably would have said Hungarian second. He probably would have said journalist or member of the human race third. Jew was way down the list, and he was confronted in a very difficult way with the reality that he was Jewish and he lacked honor. And so initially what Herzl wanted to do was to regain honor for the Jewish people so that he himself could be an honorable person. And he flirted with some solutions. Well, he had two very far-fetched solutions. The first was he wanted to take all the Jews of Vienna and stand in front of St. Stephen's Cathedral and in a grand midday ceremony have everyone convert to Christianity together. Herzl. Didn't work because it's stupid. The second one is he's figured, since it was about dueling, he said, you know what we'll do? We'll get 12 or 15 really big Jewish guys, and we'll challenge 12 or 15 Christian guys to duels, and we'll win, and we'll show that Jews can duel. But of course, that's the causality is background. It's backward. It isn't that Jews lack honor because they can't duel. It's because Jews can't duel because they lack honor. Now, so he's still searching for a solution. At the time, as a journalist, he was sent to Paris to cover the trial of Alfred Dreyfus. Now, Dreyfus was an assimilated French Jew who was convicted of treason, long story short, and when he was convicted in this public ceremony in Paris, the mob turned on him and began chanting, "Death to the Jews," and this is the moment where in Herzl's mind, he realized that anti-Semitism was something inescapable, that emancipation and citizenship and even assimilation was no way to escape anti-Semitism. This you got to hear in his words. Look at text number 2 on your handout. This is the first thing he ever wrote about anything Jewish, which was, first he wrote it for a Viennese newspaper and then was published in the Jewish Chronicle in London in 1896. Quote, "The Jewish question still exists." By the way, the Jewish question was the question of, can Jews be assimilated into a modern society? You may have heard the term, by the way, what Hitler called the Holocaust, he didn't call it the Holocaust, he called it the final solution to the Jewish question. So this is before there was ever a final solution, or Hitler's final solution, here's Herzl talking about the Jewish question. The Jewish question still exists, the question of, can Jews be assimilated? It would be foolish to deny it. It exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not exist, it will be brought by Jews in the course of their migrations. There he's talking about America, where there wasn't much in the way of anti-Semitism, and Herzl said, oh, but there will be eventually. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. This is true in every country. It will remain true even in the most highly civilized. France is no exception, till the Jewish question finds a solution on a political basis. And his solution to the Jewish question was a sovereign Jewish state. So it was a combination of Pinsker's notion of sovereignty as a way for Jews to control their own identity, and Herzl's notion of sovereignty and a sovereign state would give Jews a sense of honor. They would be honored by the other peoples of the world. And that was his principal aim. Now, along these lines, a year later, in 1897, he organized the first Zionist Congress. It took place in Basel, Switzerland. The reason it took place in Basel, Switzerland was because most high-profile Jewish communities, he wanted to have it in Berlin, in Budapest, in Vienna, in London, in Paris, in Geneva. All those Jewish communities said, absolutely not. You remember I said this was a really crazy, radical idea. I doubt the Jewish community would allow a conference to take place advocating that Jews all go to Mars. I don't think that, or maybe let's all move to the Amazon basin. I don't think that would happen. Okay. So this was the first Zionist Congress where he articulated what came to be known as the Basel Program, the basic tenets of Zionism. Now, his Zionism was predominantly political, which meant through diplomatic means and through settlement means to achieve some kind of sovereignty. Naturally, this first Zionist Congress, in its very radical nature, elicited some very harsh criticism from other Jews in Europe, the overwhelming majority of which were not Zionists by this point. Let me show you two of these responses. They came from very different directions. Reform Jews were 100% against this because in the mind of Reform Jews, first of all, being Jewish was not a nationality, it was only your religion. Reform Jews believed they were, Germans of the Jewish persuasion or Frenchmen of the Jewish persuasion. Being Jewish was only your religion. It wasn't your nationality. It wasn't the entirety of your identity. And Zionism was creating this new kind of Jewish identity where your nationality is Jewish and not where you live. So this is a group of Reform rabbis known as the Protest Rabbiner, which is German means obviously the protesting rabbis. They said the following, text number 3. What more can one say if people are so naive as to believe that West European Jews will hand over their money to purchase Palestine from the Turks and to create a Jewish organization, and here's the key phrase, that will reverse the entire development of the Jewish nation. 1,800 years ago, meaning when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, history made its decision regarding Jewish nationhood through the dissolution of the Jewish state and the destruction of the temple. The Zionists want to provide an internationally guaranteed place to call home for those Jews who cannot or do not wish to assimilate in their present place of residence. But where are the Jews who do not wish to assimilate? The fact that right that they are still unable to assimilate in many countries makes it precisely our duty to fight in common with the most noble and best men of all confessions for the removal of discriminatory laws. These were rabbis and these were Jews who still believed that emancipation, citizenship would eventually lead to Jews being fully accepted in the societies in which they lived. And the fact is, they're not entirely wrong. Many places, Jews have lived for quite some time. Okay, but they regarded Zionism as a kind of retrograde, completely missing the point. Now, from the other end of the spectrum, Orthodox Jews also regarded Zionism as a form of heresy, because the traditional belief is, remember, Shivat Zion, where Jews were supposed to wait for the Messiah to take them back to the land of Israel and to restore the kingdom of David and rebuild the temple. And Zionism, in its secular humanist stupidity from this Orthodox vantage point, was rejecting this basic commandment, this basic instruction. Here's an example of that, text number 4. This is from a leading Hasidic rabbi in the city of Lublin, Tzadok HaKohen Rabinowitz. A voice was heard on high. In Hebrew, it's, kol barama, which is a standard phrase, not only in rabbinic writing, but it's also the phrase that begins a writ of excommunication, just in case. A voice of lamentation from the imperial city of Vienna, where the Third Zionist Congress took place, in a matter relating to all Israel. It concerns the sect that has arisen recently under the name of Zionists. Now, sect, as opposed to denomination, always means heretical sect. Under the name of Zionists. They drag iniquity by cords of vanity and lift up their souls to folly. A phrase lifted right out of an edict of excommunication, hoping that in the course of time, the children of Israel will be subdued under their government and subordinated to transgressors. We surely know that if we were believers and truly trusted in the salvation of the Lord and observers of the commandments of God, we would even today be dwelling in our holy land. In other words, this guy thinks that Zionism is some kind of divine retribution for Jewish sinfulness. Yet, now there have arisen fools and malicious conspirers whose deeds are born of a bitter poison. They proclaim that life in Israel is in jeopardy and that they, the Zionists, will hasten salvation by founding a state. So, Zionism was radical and Zionism elicited these responses, but Herzl was able to move forward. Now, that's the combating anti-Semitism dimension of Zionism. You create a state as a refuge, as a way for Jews to escape anti-Semitism, which Herzl believed was endemic and inescapable everywhere in the diaspora. And he believed places that, in physics terms, anti-Semitism, he believes, was stable equilibrium. If it's not anti-Semitic now, it will eventually be. Okay. What about the assimilation side of things? Well, a student of Pinsker was the first to address this. And this was a Russian Zionist whose name was Asher Ginsburg. He grew up in a small town, in a shtetl. He moved to Odessa, where all the leading Jewish intellectuals lived. And he actually was very much inspired by Pinsker. He joined one of those Zionist settlement organizations in the 1880s. He became a member of Chovevei Zion. And eventually he began to think that the goal of Zionism can't simply be a change of address, can't simply be moving from the diaspora to the land of Israel. Ginsburg was the first to say that Zionism, if it's to be successful and something meaningful, has to create a way for Jews to be transformed. Not only move from place to place, he began to talk about the transformation of Jews. He wanted to invent a new kind of Jew or a new sense of Jewish identity. And what he came up with is what we would now call secular Jewish identity. See, until this point, Jewish identity was measured exclusively in religious terms. You were more observant, you were less observant. You were pious, you were indifferent. You were Hasidic, you were a heretic. That was the standard. What Ahad Ha'am was suggesting, and remember, he believed that religion, and he was correct, religion and a religious way of life was having a diminishing appeal on Jews, especially young Jews, and he suggested the very radical possibility that it's possible to define one's Jewishness apart from religious belief or practice. And that's what comes to be known as secular Jewish identity. Now, you have to hear it the way he said it, because he first expressed his idea in the form of a critique. He was very critical of those Western European Jews and Jews in America who were living comfortably as citizens and thought they were fine. Now, one of the things that Ginsburg said is that anti-Semitism is not the only problem. The other one is assimilation. But he wrote an essay in 1900, in the 1890s, called Avdut B'toch Cherut, Slavery Within Freedom. This is text number 5. Look what he writes. Do I envy the rights of our brethren in Western Europe, meaning envy the rights they enjoy that we don't, because Russian Jews were still second-class citizens? I answer truthfully and simply no, neither them nor their reward. Even if I lack rights, I have not forfeited my soul in exchange for them. I can say aloud that my fellow Jews everywhere are beloved to me without having to invent an excuse. Because remember, emancipated Jews, they redefined being Jewish as simply a religious faith. And one of the expectations associated with emancipation was having more solidarity with your fellow citizen who wasn't Jewish than with Jews elsewhere. So Ginsburg is saying, I can say aloud, my fellow Jews everywhere are beloved to me without having to invent an excuse. I am allowed to remember Jerusalem not only during moments of worship. I can still have a fully defined Jewish identity. So he wanted to define something apart from a religious-based identity, which he, in his mind, was played out, would not be able to resist assimilation, and he came up with secular Jewish identity. Now, what did secular Jewish identity consist of? First and foremost, it revolved around the Hebrew language. Now, as luck would have it, even before there was Zionism, in Russia in the 1860s, 20 years before there was Zionists, there were Russian Jewish, enlightened Russian Jewish intellectuals who, for a variety of reasons, which is really a separate story, had reinvented Hebrew as a modern literary language. There were modern Hebrew newspapers and poems and stories, because previously Hebrew had only been the language of prayer and rabbinic discourse. Now, when Achad Ha'am was writing this, and this is going to sound a little counterintuitive, there were no Jews anywhere in the world, including in the land of Israel, who spoke Hebrew as their language. Nobody spoke Hebrew. You prayed in Hebrew. Rabbis wrote things in Hebrew. Jews would either speak the vernacular language of the land or a Jewish dialect of the vernacular language, Yiddish, Ladino, whatever. Nobody spoke Hebrew. And what Achad Ha'am is saying, Ginsburg, who went by the pen name Achad Ha'am, which is Hebrew for one of the people, very ironic because he was a huge intellectual snob who wanted nothing to do with ordinary people, ordinary unwashed masses, but he really believed he spoke for them. What? Achad Ha'am, Ginsburg, what he believed is that Jews must have a national language in order to resist the temptations of other cultures. If you want Jews to appreciate being Jewish, and he means Jews who've lost interest in religion, if you want them to appreciate being Jewish, you have to give them not only a modern Hebrew literature and modern Hebrew poetry and a modern Hebrew newspaper, but also a modern language that can be used in all forms of daily life. So the beginnings of this secular Jewish culture was the Hebrew language. Now, fortunately for him, he had a compatriot who also had become a Zionist around the same time, a friend of his from Europe, whose name was Eliezer ben Yehuda. And Eliezer ben Yehuda believed the same thing. He'd come up through the ranks. He was a Zionist. He also believed it wasn't only about anti-Semitism, it was about assimilation. And eventually Eliezer ben Yehuda and his wife and their children, they moved to the land of Israel. They made Aliyah. They joined one of these new settlements that was formed, new Jewish settlements. But he did a little experiment, Eliezer ben Yehuda. He and his wife, they began speaking only Hebrew to their children. Now, like I said, no one else in the world was using Hebrew as a daily language. Eliezer ben Yehuda and his wife were the first to do it. And it wasn't easy, because it turned out that there was no modern Hebrew word for socks or railroad. He had to invent, or tomato. He had to invent a lot of words, but he did, and he eventually wrote the first modern Hebrew dictionary. So the Hebrew, Eliezer ben Yehuda, helped Achad Ha'am construct that core part of secular Jewish culture. But secular Jewish culture was a lot more than simply the Hebrew language. It was a revaluing of all of Jewish culture, from the Bible all the way forward. So, for a secular Jew, the Bible is not a book of religious instruction. The Bible is the great historical narrative of the Jewish people, the great national historical narrative of the Jewish people. The Talmud is not a book of religious instruction. The Talmud is the story of great Jewish leaders and thinkers in different contexts. And in this way, he revalued all of Jewish tradition. And so, for Achad Ha'am, the secular Jew who had given up any kind of Jewish observance, being Jewish, you could still do a lot of Jewish things. They simply had a different purpose. I'll give you an example. Look at text number 6. One of his most famous sayings, I'll read it for you in Hebrew because his Hebrew was fantastic. If you ever wanted an excuse to learn Hebrew, learn it so you can read Achad Ha'am in his Hebrew. He had the best Hebrew since the Rambam, and then Bialik came and his Hebrew was better. Okay, so look what he says in text number 6. Yoter me Yisrael shamar al ha-Shabbat, ha-Shabbat shamra al Yisrael. More than Jews kept the Sabbath kept or preserved the Jews. In his mind, the importance of the Sabbath is not a religious getting closer to God. No, it's something that Jews did collectively together as a community, as a people, all over the world. It had cultural significance for Achad Ha'am more than it had religious significance. Now, here's one of those Seder nuggets I promised you, because Achad Ha'am had a very interesting understanding of Bible stories. Now, Achad Ha'am knew that, generally speaking, when Achad Ha'am was in the turn of the 20th century, there were two ways that people read the Bible. There was the traditional way, where you would read the Bible as stories that actually happened, and there was the critical way, and critical Bible scholars said, there's no evidence that there was a Moses, and there's no evidence that any of this happened. And Achad Ha'am said, both of those are kind of missing the boat, and he wrote an essay called Moshe Moses. This is text number 7, where he's basically explaining, yes, there's the traditional, literal way of reading the Bible. We don't do that. And there's the critical way. Here he's especially challenging that critical, and remember, the critical way saying, unless you have historical evidence to prove it wasn't true. Here's what he says. And thus, when I read the Haggadah on Passover, and the spirit of Moses ben Amram, that's Moses from the Bible, hero of heroes who was perched atop our history like a pillar of light, floating before my eyes, I am not concerned whatsoever at that moment regarding those questions and doubts that Gentile scholars raise. Did Moses really exist? Did he live and act according to what Jews believed? Was he really the Redeemer of Israel who gave them the Torah as our tradition tells, and other such questions? Rather, I brush aside all of these questions with one simple short answer. This primordial Moses, whose existence and identity you wish to clarify, is a matter only for scholars like you, academic scholars, he means. But we Jews have a different Moses, our Moses. I love the phrase, Moshe Shelanu. He whose image has been affixed in the heart of our people, sorry for the typos, from generation to generation, and whose influence on our national life has not ceased from antiquity to the present. The historical existence of this Moses does not depend at all on your historical investigations. I love this phrase. Even if you were able to demonstrate with complete certainty that Moses never existed, it would not detract an iota from the historical existence of the ideal Moses, who led us not only 40 years through the Sinai desert, but also for thousands of years through all the deserts that we have traversed from our sojourn in Egypt until now. So he was a secular Jew with a real Jewish sense of identity and community, a real Jewish soul, which is one of the reasons why, apart from Achad Ha'am has his pen name, his nickname in Zionist circles, they called him the agnostic rabbi, because he spoke like a rabbi, but he didn't believe in God. He spoke in very secular terms. And this secular Jewish culture was realized in the state of Israel, in the modern state. When you go to Israel, if you want to see Achad Ha'am's notion of secular Jewish culture come to fruition and realized, all you have to do is walk around the streets of Tel Aviv and most other Israeli cities. Tel Aviv is a secular city, Really, there are only two things that really vividly distinguish Tel Aviv from a European city or an American city. One is the whole city works in Hebrew. It's a city, it is a secular Jewish city that works in Hebrew. And secondly, just look at the street signs. The street signs in Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities are the names of important figures from Jewish history. And they're just usually designed by neighborhoods. You have the neighborhood where everyone's name was like a medieval scholar, like Maimonides Street, Rambam Street. You have names of the tribes of Israel. Of course, you have names of the founders of Zionism, Herzl Boulevard. I don't think you're going to find any of those street names in any other country, and that is the point. It's the great historical narrative of the Jewish people that is the heart of this secular Jewish culture. And today, 80% of Israelis are secular Jews. 80% of Israelis are Jewish, what we might say, nusach achad ha'am, in the style of achad ha'am. He was very important. Now, he wasn't the last to add an additional layer here. He had a contemporary whose name was Aaron David Gordon, or in Hebrew he's called Aleph Dalet Gordon. Gordon is another interesting story. He came a little bit later to the land of Israel. He made Aliyah a little later. When he moved to Israel, he was over 50 years old. And typically, when you were that old and you made Aliyah, you didn't join one of the new agricultural settlements. That was for young people, 20-somethings. Older people would basically go in one of the towns and get a desk job or be an intellectual. But Gordon joined one of these moshavim, one of these Jewish settlements. It must have been very weird. I always tell my students, it would be like me moving into the dorm with you. But the strange thing is, they weren't freaked out by him. He became a kind of guru for these young Jewish, the term for these Jews were chalutzim, pioneers, who had left the shtetls of Eastern Europe, left their city life, and basically become farmers in the land of Israel. And Gordon became their guru because he preached. What he added to Zionism was what came to be known as spiritual Zionism, not spiritual in the religious sense, where he said that Jewish renewal, as important as it is to have sovereignty in a state and secular Jewish culture, Jews will only be fully transformed if they reunite with the soil of the land of Israel. Jews must return to the land, and he was being very literal. He wrote this in beautiful ways, but look at text number 8. I'll give it to you in a single word, a single sentence. And his most famous sentence was, Anu banu arza, livnot ulehibanot ba. We have come to this land to build it and be transformed or built by it. That's Gordon in a nutshell. And what he really started came to be known as labor Zionism. Transformation, rejuvenation through physical labor. So he agreed with Achad Ha'am, and he thought Achad Ha'am was great. But he said, what you're doing, sitting behind that desk and writing all these wonderful essays is great, but it's not the full story. You must be fully transformed. Now, Gordon's labor Zionism happened to coincide with the emergence of another kind of Zionism, and this, very briefly, remember I mentioned there were Jews who had become Russian socialists in 1881. There was a second wave of pogroms in Russia in 1903, beginning in 1903, including the infamous Kishinev pogrom. But this time, the situation was a little different. In 1881, the Russian socialists had condemned the pogroms as being counter-revolutionary. In 1903, they endorsed the pogroms as being a blow against Jewish capitalists. And so many Jews who had become socialists became disillusioned with Russian socialism. But they didn't want to give up social revolution. They just didn't think that socialism was going to eliminate anti-Semitism. So what they did instead was to create a hybrid of socialism and Zionism together, which came to be known as Marxist or Socialist Zionism. It was basically saying, we want to go build a Jewish state, and in that Jewish state, we want to have the same kind of Marxist revolution that every other state is going to have. It was a really interesting hybrid. Now, the politics was complicated. Their leading voice was a guy whose name was Ber Bolochov. If I had lots of time, I would tell you all about this guy. Hardcore Marxist, a real bona fide Marxist. But their biggest contribution was the way in which they fused with Gordon's labor Zionism. Particularly, they created a new kind of Jewish agricultural settlement. Now, to this point, these new Jewish settlements were called a moshav, which simply means a settlement. They were basically a farm where everyone would have their own little plot of land. Most of them were failing. They were failing because, turns out, if you've never had any experience working on a farm, it's really hard work. You got to wake up early and your back hurts. It's hard. And most of these city Jews who came there with all their good intentions failed. But the labor Zionists, or these Marxist Zionists who joined Gordon's labor Zionist movement, they created a new kind of settlement called the kibbutz. Originally, it was called a kvutza, which simply means a group. They renamed it a kibbutz because there's a phrase from the Bible called kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exile. And so this is another example of secular Jews using this great religious language. And the kibbutzim, which were collective settlements, they overcame all the limitations of the moshavim, which weren't working. These kibbutzim, in many ways, they saved the whole, or they rejuvenated the whole process of settling the land. But the kibbutz wasn't only a particular form of organization and a particular political mentality. These Jews, they really completed this notion of transformation. They had a very different way of seeing the world. And the kibbutzim, many of them were very successful. And here's the other Seder nugget I want to give you, just to show you the mentality, the sense of Jewish identity of these kibbutzim, which is going to combine a Zionist, secular Jewish identity with a more universal socialist identity. Look at text number 9. This comes from the Haggadah that was used by a kibbutz called Kibbutz Na'an, which was one of the real hardcore secular Marxist kibbutzim. And this is in that Haggadah. These are the 4 questions as the members of this kibbutz would ask on their Seder on Passover. Now remember, in this collective settlement, for example, children were all raised together. Parents didn't always live with children, so they got to eat together in the dining hall. This was a very different way of life. So, question number 1, it starts, Mani yishtanah halayla hazeh. How is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights, the children eat in their own dining hall, but on this night, we eat together. Parents, children, and friends. Not your usual first question. Nothing about matzah. Second, how is the condition of Jews different from the condition of every other nation? Every other nation resides in its own home and birthplace, but Jews are scattered throughout the world, despised and persecuted, and even in their homeland, the land of Israel, they cannot live without hindrance. It's talking about the land of Israel exists to give, this Jewish state we want to create will give Jews a kind of refuge from anti-Semitism. Now, number 3 gets to something more universal. This is a more universal socialist notion. Why are there people in the world who are rich and poor, sated and hungry, workers and idlers, and why do people fight with one another instead of helping one another to be happy and fulfilled? So you don't find that in most Haggadot, although there are contemporary Haggadot which borrow some of these ideas. And number 4, when will the day come when Kibbutz Na'an will be large and beautiful with a multitude of members and much land, and when many of our brothers from the diaspora will come here to help us build together? In other words, when will our Zionist vision be revealed, be realized, fully realized? Okay, now this notion of transformation could be very personal. I want to give you 2 examples of individuals, Jews who came from the diaspora and became part of this labor Zionist world and were transformed. Example number 1. There was this young Russian Jew whose name was David Green. He's probably David Green. He lived in a shtetl. He became a Zionist. Then he became a labor Zionist. He joined a kibbutz. He didn't like the name David Green because it was too diaspora. It was too galut sounding, gullus. It was too diaspora. So he changed his name from David Green to David Ben-Gurion, David Ben-Gurion. First of all, it's Hebrew. Green is a more Yiddish-sounding name, but Ben-Gurion is a biblical phrase which means son of the lion, strength. This is David Green being transformed through Zionism. The other one, a young girl from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whose name was Golda Meyerson. Meyerson is a very diaspora name. She changed her name to Golda Meir. Meir is a Hebrew word which means illuminator. They were transformed through their immersion in the life of the kibbutz. Now, in terms of transformation, everything I've said so far is only about secular Jews, but what I mentioned to you that there was a religious dimension. There is something called religious Zionism. And where did this come from? Well, it turns out that there were Jews, religious Jews, Orthodox Jews in the diaspora, who didn't see Zionism as something heretical. Now, most Orthodox Jews did, and the overwhelming majority of Hasidic Jews did, but there were some Jews who saw it differently. They saw it, now remember, the problem that Orthodox Jews had with Zionism, it was heretical because you weren't waiting for the Messiah, but there were some Orthodox Jews who, using a rabbinic phrase, they defined Zionism as Atchalta di Geula, which in Aramaic means the beginnings or the first steps toward messianic redemption. So even if the Zionists or this endeavor is not in and of itself messianic, it's going to bring us closer to the messianic age. And this mentality was the basis of a kind of Zionism, a brand of Zionism that came to be known as Mizrahi Zionism, which fused together a religiously observant lifestyle with the secular ideology of Zionism. Now, they chose the name Mizrahi very deliberately. A great double entendre. First of all, Mizrahi means eastward or eastern looking, because there's the notion that the Messiah is supposed to come from the east. But Mizrahi was also a contraction of two Hebrew words, Merkaz Ruchani, spiritual center. Because they believed that Zionists, that joining the Zionist movement, and especially being an observant Jew first in Palestine, then eventually in a Jewish state, would lead to a kind of spiritual renewal. Now, to be clear, Gordon's spiritual renewal through labor was secular. This is actual religious spiritual renewal. But I want you to hear it in their own words. Look at text number 10. This is from the manifesto of the Mizrahi Zionist movement. What do they say? In the lands of the diaspora, the soul of our people, our holy Torah, can no longer be preserved in its full strength, nor can the commandments which comprise the entire spiritual life of the people be kept in their original purity, because the times are besieging us with difficult demands. In other words, what they're saying is modernity makes it virtually impossible to be a fully observant Jew in the diaspora. There's simply too many expectations and the demands of citizenship. It is impossible for us to respond to those demands without ignoring the holy treasure entrusted to us at Sinai, without, God forbid, turning into a thing of little value in our eyes, as each of us strays further and further away from each other. In other words, from a Mizrahi point of view, Zionism was not only not heretical, it was a necessary antidote to the way that modernity had corroded the possibilities of a religious lifestyle. Now, this was brave because in their own Orthodox world, they took a lot of heat for doing this. In fact, most Orthodox anti-Zionists, they reserve their harshest criticisms, not for secular Zionists, but for Mizrahi Zionists, because, you should know better, you're misleading people, you're the biggest traitors of all. Okay. That's the essence of Mizrahi. Now, the leading voice of the Mizrahi movement was a rabbi whose name was Abraham Isaac Kook, often simply known as Rav Kook, who really gave some real ideology for this notion of Zionism. Now, he built on this notion that Zionism is the first steps towards redemption. He took it a step further. He said, those secular Zionists, even though they're secular and don't think they're religious, without even realizing it, they're performing a religious act by building the state, which was a remarkable thing to say. He said that Zionism, despite the fact that it's secular, unreligious, or even anti-religious, is something sacred. Look at text number 11. This is in his words. The bricks, meaning the bricks to build up the Jewish people of the land, the bricks can also be borne by those who do not divine the religious meaning of the work. Even if they don't know they're religious anyway. They can even supervise the work. When the time comes, however, the hidden meaning will be revealed. One of these days, these secular Zionists are going to find out that they're religious. Now, of course, when he said this to secular Zionists, they thought that was really funny. What a quaint old man. But everybody loved him. He really fostered a sense of unity between religious and secular Jews. Okay. Now, these are all examples of how Zionism transformed people, but for most Jews living in the diaspora, the main aim of Zionism, leaving the diaspora and moving to the land of Israel, was simply not in the cards, especially for American Jews. But in America especially, we have the emergence of a variation on the whole Zionist notion, which made it possible to be a firm, committed Zionist without actually leaving the diaspora. And one of the first to define this variation was none other than Justice Louis Brandeis. Now, Brandeis is an interesting story. You know, before he became the first Jewish Supreme Court justice in 1915, he came from an assimilated, more or less Jewish home in Louisville. He had an uncle who was religious, whose name was Louis Dembitz. That's why he took the middle name Dembitz. But he basically had very little Jewish identity, but eventually he found his way to Zionism. Now, it's interesting. Brandeis became a Zionist in 1913. When he was the most high-profile Jew in America. He was en route to the Supreme Court. Before he became a Zionist, there were fewer than 1,000 American Jews who were Zionists. Think about it. You come all the way from Eastern Europe, and you're going to embrace an ideology which is going to ask you to move again? Not to mention you're maybe a little insecure about being in America. You don't want people to accuse you of dual loyalty. Then Brandeis became a Zionist. Within a couple of months, 300,000 American Jews became Zionists. All the immigrants became Zionists. And Brandeis, 2 years later, made a speech in which he reconciled being a Zionist and being an American citizen. Look at text number 12. This is from 1915. Let no American imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with patriotism. Multiple loyalties are objectionable only if they are inconsistent. A man is a better citizen of the United States for being also a loyal citizen of his state and for his city, for being loyal to his family and to his profession or trade, from being loyal to his college or his lodge. Every Irish American who contributed toward advancing home rule in Ireland was a better man and a better American for the sacrifice he made. Every American Jew who aids in advancing the Jewish settlement in Palestine, though he feels that neither he nor his descendants will ever live there, will likewise be a better man and a better American for doing so. There is no consistency between loyalty to America and loyalty to Jewry. The Jewish spirit, the product of our religion and experiences, is essentially modern and essentially American. And here's the key phrase. Indeed, loyalty to America demands rather that each American become a Zionist. And when Brandeis spoke, American Jews listened. This is what made Zionism something acceptable and mainstream within American Jewry. Now, I should also point out that Brandeis' basic assumption here is that the basic values of Zionism are consistent with American notions of civil rights and what we would call liberal American values as well. And this was true all the way until June of 1967. Brandeis' calculus about no inconsistency here was challenged with the emergence of the Palestinian problem several generations later. One of the problems we're having right now with this tension between American values and being connected to the state of Israel is Brandeis' basic assumption is still intact, I would say, but it's murkier than it was. I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, now, everything I've said so far, this really gives us a sense of the different visions of the state. Brandeis, what he adds to the equation is what we call third-person Zionism. I'm a Zionist, I support the state, but I have no intention of living there, and that's fine. But Brandeis also became the conduit through the transformation of American Jewry by the addition of Zionism, because there were many American Jews in the open society of America for whom religion had less and less meaning. And Zionism provided the non-religious alternative to have a strong Jewish identity in America, despite the fact that you didn't have much of a religious identity. And for example, Mordechai Kaplan, who created a movement called Reconstructionist Judaism, which, this is really a separate story, becomes the blueprint for all American Jewry within a couple of generations. He was a devout Zionist, devout in the secular sense. He very much believed in the ideas of Achad Ha'am and secularity, but also Brandeis' notion of doing the same thing together. Okay. Now, in the last couple of minutes, let me turn to the other aspect here. All of this is going to crystallize into the Jewish state. Certainly, if you think about the Israeli government, we've identified two of its three pieces. The Israeli left really grew out of the ideas of, especially Gordon's labor Zionism, and the religious parties grew out of this notion of Mizrahi Zionism. We haven't mentioned the Israeli right, but we can't mention them without saying a word about the emergence of a conflict between Zionists and between the whole enterprise of building a Jewish state and the indigenous population of Palestinians there. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Now, the original Zionists, they didn't even recognize the possibility of a problem. A contemporary of Herzl, whose name was Israel Zangwill, he described Zionism as, he described it as a land without a people for a people without a land. Some of these early Europeans, remember, they're Europeans. They had trouble recognizing indigenous non-European populations. And then later on, labor Zionists, although they very much recognized that there was an indigenous population of Arabs living in Palestine, their basic notion, Ben-Gurion's basic notion is, as long as we have sufficient economic development and raise everyone's standard of living, there won't be any conflict between Zionism and the local population, which seemed to make sense. The first to challenge that was a Zionist writer whose name was Yitzhak Epstein, who you probably never heard of. He's really only important for an essay he wrote in 1907 called She'elah Ne'elma. He published it in the Zionist newspaper. She'elah Ne'elma means the hidden question. Look at text number 13. I'll give you a little excerpt here. And remember, he's responding to the notion that economic development, kibbutzim, the moshav, is going to preclude all conflict. Among the difficult issues regarding the rebirth of our people in its homeland, one issue outweighs them all, our relation with the Arabs. I think we'll agree with that. In general, now listen to this, we have made a crude psychological blunder in our relationship with a large, if assertive and passionate people. At a time when we are feeling the love of the homeland with all our might, the land of our forefathers, we are forgetting that the people who live there now also have a sensitive heart and a loving soul. The Arab, like any man, has a strong bond with his homeland. The lower his level of development, the narrower his perspective, the stronger his bond to the land and to the region, and the harder it is for him to part with his village and his field. The Muslim will not abandon his country. He will not wander far. He has many traditions which bind him to the soul of his homeland. And Epstein turned out to be very prescient here. He was exactly right. Ben-Gurion's notion of economic development as a way to preclude conflict turned out to be idealistic and naive. And what Epstein said a century ago is still true to this day. Because even today, the argument is, why are they fighting with us? We're going to give them good internet. We're going to give them better schools and better what? Because Epstein said, and he's exactly right, it isn't only about material life. They have a deep connection to the land too. That is something emotional. And you have to recognize it and you have to acknowledge it. Now, Epstein wrote this in 1907 at a time when there was very little conflict. The real conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine began after the First World War for the following, and really was animated by the following three things. First of all, during the course of the First World War, long story short, the Arabs in the Middle East, this is when they become politicized. This is the emergence of Arab nationalism. This is when we have the emergence of independent Arab states like Iraq and Iran out of the Ottoman Empire. That's first. The Arabs become politicized, and we have the emergence of Arab nationalism. Secondly, by the end of the First World War, that whole Zionist enterprise of building a state, it was really working, and suddenly it was starting to look like an actual state. There was an actual, there was a skeleton. You had the Zionist executive, which looked like the executive branch. You had the Jewish agency, which looked like a department of the interior. You had self-defense units, which were cultivated on the kibbutzim, which looked like a military. It was beginning to look like a state, and that was beginning to alarm Arab leaders. And third, and probably the most significant in retrospect, is the British government, which took control of Palestine in 1917 and was given full authority, the British Mandate in 1922, they could not have made a bigger mess out of this situation. I don't always like to blame people, and if you're British, I'm really sorry, but in the same way that the British mucked up so many parts of the world through their botched colonial policies, they did it here too. And this is what happened. Okay? In 1915, the British made a secret agreement with Arab leaders, particularly the leader of the Husseini family, they had one branch in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, one branch in Palestine. They basically promised the area that included Palestine as a sovereign state after the First World War was over, when the Ottoman Empire was gone. That was a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. 2 years later, they made an open agreement with Zionist leaders called the Balfour Declaration, where they promised Palestine to the Jews as a Jewish state. They promised the same piece of land to two different national groups. Bad parenting. I mean, who would do that? And from that moment on, both Jews and Arabs in the region, not only did they have an emotional claim and a historical claim, but now they all both had a legal claim. The British said, the British who have been given a jurisdiction over this territory by the League of Nations, they said we can have it. Now, why did the British do it? Well, this is really the worst part. The British, what they were most concerned about was not Palestine or even the Middle East, except maybe the oil, but that was a little bit later. Their biggest concern was the jewel of the crown, India. They were having some trouble in India with this guy named Gandhi, who was fighting for home rule. There was a great movie made about him. You must have seen it. It's like 6 hours long. It's a great movie. I have to admit, I watch it every time it comes on. I can't watch the whole thing. I watch from about 45 minutes in till about a half an hour from the end. But great movie. But the British strategy was, with Gandhi, the best way to handle Gandhi is to use Muslims in India as a counterweight against him. And the best way to do that is to be on good terms with Muslims all over the British Empire, which was basically in the process of collapsing, but still there. So they began to really, what's the phrase, bend over backwards for Muslims in Palestine, Arabs in Palestine, not because they cared about Palestine, but because they wanted to be on good terms with Muslims in India. And that exacerbated the conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. A third-party great power, if that was managing the problem a little bit more judiciously, a little bit more skillfully and diplomatically, might have diffused a lot of that problem. I mean, we have echoes of this right now. To me personally, and I'm not making any kind of political preference here, but our president just moved the embassy to Jerusalem and was just showered with adulation, which of course he loves, all presidents do. What he's forgetting is the responsibility of the United States and the president isn't to move the embassy, it's to broker a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. That's what he promised, and now that is going to be much, much more difficult. Even though truth of the matter is, where the embassy is going in Arnona hasn't really changed anything. I mean, long story short, all that's really changed in Israel, moving the embassy hasn't precluded a future creating of an embassy to a Palestinian state in East Jerusalem. All it's really effectively done till this point is it's made it so the U.S. ambassador to Israel doesn't have to commute to Tel Aviv anymore. He gets to work in Jerusalem, and my own cynical self thinks that's the whole reason why they did it, because he was bored driving to Tel Aviv, which can be a schlep. Okay. In any case, the British mishandling demonstrated the significance of, well, first of all, it demonstrated that the conflict between, in that case, Zionists and Arabs, today Israel and the Palestinians, is not a two-sided conflict, it's three-sided. It's Israel, it's Arabs or Palestinians, and it's the great power which is managing the region. It's a real responsibility. Okay, in any case, the surge, the rise of this conflict in Palestine, coupled with surging anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe during the 1920s and the 1930s, prompted the emergence of the last kind of Zionism that came to be known as revisionist Zionism. And this was the brainchild of a Russian Jew named Zev Jabotinsky. Now, Jabotinsky, for a long time, was kind of villainized or demonized in Israel. He was seen as being a radical right-winger. That's a bit exaggerated. Jabotinsky, he had a number of important ideas. First of all, he was most critical of Ben-Gurion's idealism. He agreed with Epstein. The Arabs, this conflict is a real conflict which cannot be settled through economic development. Well, let's hear it in his words. Let's read a couple of things Jabotinsky wrote, because he's enormously important, not only for the pathway to statehood, but also for the politics of the state in past and present. Okay. He wrote an essay called The Iron Wall. Okay. And this is what he writes. This is text number 15. I am reputed to be an enemy of the Arabs, militant enemy of the Arabs, who wants to have them ejected from Palestine and so forth. It is not true. I consider it utterly impossible to eject Arabs from Palestine. There will always be two nations in Palestine, which is good enough for me, provided the Jews become the majority. And that was his main idea. He said he believed two things. He said the Jewish state has to have a Jewish majority, but the creation of a Jewish majority was not an end in and of itself. It was a means to a greater end, and the greater end was what Jabotinsky said: the state has to be democratic and it has to be Jewish, and the only way you can do both of those things at the same time is if there is a Jewish majority. Now, he died in 1940. Later, a generation later, there was another more radical thinker named Meir Kahane. He advocated the Jewish majority as an end in and of itself, claiming to speak in the name of Jabotinsky, but in many ways distorting it. Let me give you one little bit from Jabotinsky. Look at text number 16. The main aim of Zionism is to create a Jewish majority in the land of Israel on both sides of the Jordan. He had these territorial aspirations. This is not the ultimate aim of the Zionist movement, which furthers loftier ideas like the solution to hardship of Jews around the world and the creation of a new Hebrew culture, like Achad Ha'am. But the precursor condition to all of these ultimate exalted aims is a land with a Jewish majority. Only after creating a Jewish majority can the land of Israel develop in a normal way based on democratic principles without endangering the national Hebrew character of the country. Okay, so Jabotinsky died in 1940. If he were around right now and saw the current problem, he would have the following, criticism or question of the current path the state is going. He would say, you have all these Palestinians living in the West Bank, and what are you going to do? If you annex the West Bank as part of Israel, which he loved the territorial part of it, once they're part of Israel, they have to become citizens, but that will pose the demographic problem of endangering the Jewish majority. So most likely, Jabotinsky would have favored a strategy which was coined about 10 or 15 years ago called disengagement. The state of Israel will only include those areas that have a Jewish majority. Now, he died in 1940. His main disciple was Menachem Begin. Begin was the one he is the father of the Israeli right. And it's funny because for a long time, for the first 30 years of its existence, from 1948 to the 1970s, the state of Israel was governed by the left, by Ben-Gurion's party, and followed that path. And only in the 1970s did Begin finally win an election. And the state has moved in that direction. But what I think is also very interesting, when I was growing up, when I learned about Israel in the 70s, before Begin was prime minister, we always learned the Ben-Gurion story. He was the hero. We didn't learn much about Begin. We never learned about Jabotinsky. But since then, there's been a rethinking of the ideas of Jabotinsky and the ideas of Begin. In retrospect, it seemed like Jabotinsky and Begin had a certain realism, which in retrospect, and remember, hindsight is 20/20, might have been more effective in dealing with the conflict with the Palestinians than Ben-Gurion's idealism. It's hard to know. So the state was created in 1948, and I would say all of the aims of Zionism came to fruition. Jabotinsky got his Jewish majority in the territory that was created. It became a secular Jewish state, but also with a religious minority. Everything, the kibbutz, it all came together beautifully. There was an ingathering of Jews from around the world. One of the first problems that the state had to deal with, though, was when there was a large influx of Jews from Arab countries, because the antagonism between Jews and Muslims in Palestine and then in Israel, it reverberated elsewhere into the Muslim world and caused, Jews were expelled from the rest of the Muslim world, or most of it more or less. They came to Israel, and this revealed a kind of, a weakness of the state. Because remember, the state of Israel was built by Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe, coming out of a particular political context and climate, a matrix of problems, and many Jews who came to Israel, to this new state of Israel, from the Muslim world, many of them, they didn't know much what Zionism was. They were more traditional in many ways, and They were unfamiliar with the system, the way it worked. And what happened very quickly in the 1950s is that if you were an immigrant to Israel from a Middle East or North African country, you didn't have as much access to the system. The system of Israel was geared toward Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe, and there was this kind of social inequality, and there was real income inequality. Now, serving in the army narrowed that a bit, but by the 1970s it was very clear. Now, this discrepancy or this tension between Ashkenazic Jews and Middle Eastern Jews was exacerbated in 1967, because after the founding of the state, the crucial turning point obviously comes in the Six-Day War, 1967, when these new territories are annexed. And how to relate to Arabs, the Arabs who are in these territories, was complicated by the fact that Jews who had come from Middle Eastern countries, who had personal experiences living with Arabs, they had kind of a mixed attitude. On the one hand, their families had lived side by side with Arabs in these countries for generations, so there was a certain familiarity, but their more recent experience was being kicked out, so there was a certain antagonism. But what they didn't have is the idealism of Jews who had come from Eastern Europe, for whom the Middle East was living in Israel was a brand new fresh start. And so that did complicate the problem. But also the ability to reach out to Middle Eastern Jews, this is what Begin figured out how to do better than Ben-Gurion. And let me close with this illustration, because I think in many ways it illustrates right where the state is right now in many ways, okay? When Ben-Gurion would go and talk to Middle Eastern Jews, let's say in absorption camps, he would wear his kibbutz clothes. So maybe he'd wear a shirt and pants, maybe he'd wear, that sort of blue gas station attendant looking thing, and he'd go talk to them. He wanted to be one of the people, the socialist in him. When Begin went to talk with these Jews, Begin only had one suit. He didn't really wear a suit, but he always put on the suit. And the Middle Eastern Jews, who come from this very traditional world, they were very moved by the fact that Begin was treating them with more respect. And they loved him, and they were the ones essentially who voted him in. Now, the other way that Begin was able to win in the 1970s was he refashioned the deal that Ben-Gurion had made with religious Jews. In the early 1950s, Ben-Gurion had basically struck a deal with religious Jews which said that if you don't want to, you don't have to serve in the army, we will support you. As long as, and this is a big as long as, you stay in your own neighborhoods and you don't cause any problems and you don't nudge anybody. That was the deal. We're going to give you benefits without state service, without the obligation of state service, but you can't be annoying, so to speak. And it more or less worked, but in the 1970s, Begin saw an opportunity to beat Ben-Gurion, and he reached out to the religious parties, the representatives of this community, and said, if you side with me, I'll give you more. I'll give you control over ministries like education and marriage and divorce. I'll give you more. And that was the price he paid. So in one sense, Begin brought a certain realism into the prime minister's office, which made it more effective, I think, in dealing with the Palestinian problem and the problems of social inequality. But the price was he gave the religious community and the religious rabbinate more influence, which the state of Israel is still dealing with right now. So what do we have? In the state of Israel, I think we've touched on where all its first of all the greatness of the state. Because let's agree, despite all states have problems, and despite all of its problems, Israel is still a magnificent state. It's still a remarkably successful experiment in democracy, in diversity, and multiculturalism. But it does have these problems, and these problems are not immediate problems. They're rooted in the basic course of Zionism itself. So many of these problems, which seem to be problems which are very new, many of these problems are very old. Thank you. Thank you very much. So can we have a couple of questions? Does anybody have any questions after all of that?
Yeah, why was it called revisionist?
Jabotinsky's Zionism was called revisionist Zionism because basically he was revising what he believed was Ben-Gurion's idealism and Chaim Weizmann, who was sort of a centrist Zionist, his over-reliance on diplomacy. Jabotinsky said, we need action right now. We have to be more proactive in creating a state. He thought the rest of the Zionists were too passive and too slow, moving too slowly. Good question. Anyone else? Yes. Great question. Okay, now, why that's a problem? The West Bank became a territory that belonged to Israel in 1967, and at that point, the government, the leaders, it was Ben-Gurion and some others, said, what are we going to do now? And they had two choices. We could give this territory back as part of a peace deal, or we can keep it. And Ben-Gurion actually said, you know what? We're going to keep it. Ben-Gurion, who was not a religious person, in many ways he was swept up by the euphoria of victory, and the West Bank included cities like Hebron and Shem, which were of enormous historical importance, and Ben-Gurion basically said, we're going to keep it. Now, that in and of itself was not that much a problem, because Ben-Gurion's rationale was largely historical, and a historical connection is malleable, and it's negotiable. The other problem was, there was a rabbi, actually the son of Abraham Isaac Kook. Remember, Kook had said Zionism is actually, even though it's secular, it's actually something sacred, it's religious. And his son said, everything that happens to the state of Israel has religious overtones. His son said, the victory in the Six-Day War and the capturing of the West Bank was a miracle, set in motion by God, and to undo it in any way would violate some sort of divine providence. And so this is Tzvi Yehuda Kook said, we have a religious obligation to settle those territories. And so there are two kinds of Jewish settlers. There are secular settlers and there are religious settlers, in the same way that today there are two very different kinds of settlements on the West Bank. There are, Jewish settlements. There are settlements which are natural suburbs of Jerusalem. Those are not a problem. I would call those, let's call those, natural settlements or suburbs or whatever, and like Ma'ale Adumim, for example. But then there are settlements which are being set up specifically for political and ideological and theological purposes, and those settlements are more problematic. It depends. When you say the problem with the settlers, some people who are technically settlers are simply people who are living in a suburb of Jerusalem. They're Detroiters, the same way we are. Like living in West Bloomfield, you're still a Detroiter. Living on Ma'ale Adumim, you're basically living in Jerusalem. But the ones who are doing it specifically to transform or to create a kind of superficial settlement, that's more of a problem. Now, the question is, what's their end game? And for some, especially on the radical right, the end game is to build enough settlements that you can annex the West Bank. But that raises Jabotinsky's question. If you annex if the West Bank becomes part of Israel, what do we do with all those Palestinians? Expelling them is not an option. If they're part of Israel, they have to become citizens, but the numbers become a problem. So that's why the settlements is a big problem. A way to get through it is simply to distinguish between the two kinds of settlements I mentioned. If we had two different words for settlements, then we could take those natural suburbs off the table. There's no problem by them. And a settlement freeze, for example, would mean no more putting a trailer and a flag on a hilltop and calling it a settlement. A settlement is a place which is a real settlement. So you raise a good question. It's an enormously complicated issue. You'll hear a lot about it when you're there. But just understand that in the same way that American Jews are very divided on the issue, Israelis are also very divided. There are some Israelis who believe that there's a kind of manifest destiny to settle all of it. And there are some Israelis who believe the price of settling all of it and prolonging the conflict is not worth it. And both those views exist side by side. Okay. Any other? Thank you very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful trip. And Chag Sameach.